Hey, what is up, guys? This is the Legacy Brew Pub. We are back after a long time. We got the state of the Reanimator. There's been a lot going on with this deck. There's a lot to cover, and we are just going to jump right into it. To start us off, we have Chancellor of the NX. The Reanimator community is torn, split in twain over this card. Chancellor of the NX has been a long-term staple in Reanimator. Honestly, I don't think it's going anywhere. Chancellor of the NX has always been a main board staple, allowing you to execute your combo uninterrupted. But lately, we've been noticing a bit of a change here in the Legacy scene. A lot of decks are packing a lot of Reanimator hate in the main board now. I'm looking at you, Endurance, and Bajuka Bob. A lot of people are also diversifying their sideboard against Reanimator. Surgical Extraction and Leyline of the Void aren't the only answers these days. So, what is the state of the Reanimator, you ask? Well, we're making a shift over to the dark side. And look, I'm going to break it down real simple for you. The deck plays 41 black cards main and 19 non-black cards main. This means every time you start the game, you have incredibly good odds of having a free, unmask, or grief effect. And that is huge. Now to me, first thing I think of is this card here, Ataxian Probe. Ataxian Probe reads, no mana, 2 life, look at target player's hand, draw a card. Now to me, I see these cards as very similar, only inversed. Brief and Unmasked, look at a player's hand, and then instead of drawing a card, you choose and discard a card from their hand. Now I know it's a bit of a stretch, looking at it in those terms, but honestly that's what it feels like when you start out each game with this effect. I cannot understate how important it is with your combo deck to begin the game looking at your opponent's hand, seeing exactly what they have to play against you, and then taking away some piece of interaction that they have. So, back to Chancellor of the NX. This is why this community is split. Right now, there are 2 different forms of the deck. One's with Chancellor, one's without Chancellor. I love Chancellor of the NX. I've won many games off the back of Chancellor of the NX. I think Chancellor of the NX is a great card, but I do think the Reanimator deck as we know it is moving in a different direction. And that brings me to this here. This is the GOAT list. The GOAT is back. GOAT is not currently courting any content, not currently interacting with any community, not currently doing anything with Magic other than just running people over. The GOAT did start out running 3 and 4 griefs when it was revealed, but the GOAT was also running 4 Chancellors and soon moved away. I think most people did. If you go back and watch my previous State of the Reanimator videos, most people were thinking that 1 to 2 griefs was the correct number of griefs, and I was in that boat. However, something happened along the way. Canister and Archon started running lists and challenges and doing very well with either 1 or 0 Chancellor of the NX in the main. And they really started to push the Reanimator deck further than anybody had been doing. And in all actuality, Canister and Archon are the only 2 people to put up any sort of results with Reanimator in the past 6 months. So that's the true state of the Reanimator, is I think the deck is in its best possible position that it's been in quite some time, and nobody is winning with it. It's an incredibly difficult deck to play. And I'm going to take a second and I'm going to go over this deck list here, and I'm going to tell you right now, you should be playing it. And by the time I get done explaining it, I will hope that I have convinced you that you should be playing it, because this deck list is absolutely surgical. If you yourself find yourself to be some sort of competent Reanimator player, you will absolutely be able to run over your local scene with this deck list. I have no doubts about that in my mind. Small caveat, it did take me about 50 games with this deck to really be comfortable with it. I'm going to try and give you the Cliff Notes version of why it's really good, but it's going to be on you to kind of run through it, get used to it, because it does play differently from how we're used to playing Reanimator. Starting us off, we got 3 grief in the main, and that is absolutely the correct number of grief to be running. The deck list cannot really support 4, and it wouldn't really want to. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Your 3 grief combined with your 4 unmask to essentially create 7 unmask effects. Grief, 99% of the time, is only an unmask targeting your opponent. You very rarely with this list ever get the feeling that you want to turn grief towards yourself. Most of the time, grief is only going to act as a way to clear the path for you to combo off. And that's a big difference between grief and Chancellor of the Annex. So whereas historically, Chancellor of the Annex would provide you a Chancellor bubble to allow you the room to combo off, grief is paving that way. So the Chancellor bubble is soft and the grief is a hard way of interacting with your opponent. So to wrap up, when you play this deck list, you have to run 3 grief. I promise you, when you open up your 7 cards and you're on game 2 or game 3 and you're able to keep more frequently because you have more disruption in the opener, you're going to notice how easy it becomes to start tearing apart really weak keeps from your opponent. If your opponent keeps a hand with maybe say 1 force of will, 1 creature threat, a couple cantrips, and a land or 2, they really have done themselves a disservice. You're going to easily be able to strip away that force of will, be more proactive with your own combo, and really be in the driver's seat for these games that you need to win. Moving on to Serra's Emissary. Yeah, dude. Look, Serra's Emissary, an absolute house. Serra's Emissary naming artifact against affinity decks, instants against removal decks, lands against land decks, creatures against blue-red Delver, creatures against Reanimator, whatever. This thing is the silver bullet to end all silver bullets. You gotta have it in the main. It is so good. But if you're sitting here saying, Brewpub, why is it in the main when we're just gonna win off the back of Gristlebrand? That's true. The reason it's in the main is because there isn't any room in the sideboard. The sideboard is incredibly tight. I'll touch on that just after this. Next up, we got Archon of Cruelty. Archon of Cruelty is a house. It can almost single-handedly win games by itself, but it is no substitute for Gristlebrand. I don't think it's correct to run any more than 2 in any main deck at all. The only reason that we're running 2 is so we can pitch 1 to grief or unmask if we need to, and that's it. We still need to be able to pitch a copy and have 1 just in case shit hits the fan. That's the only reason we got 2. Trust me, it is absolutely perfect with that. The Gristle Dad, the GOAT himself, you can't run anything less than 4. You gotta have 4. It's the only reason we're playing this deck. Wrapping up the rest of the spells, enchantments, and artifacts, we got all the usual 4-ofs. The only thing that may stand out to you is 4 Thoughtseize and 4 Unmask. We've already touched on the Unmask, but the 4 Thoughtseize really complement it well. I wouldn't consider running any less than 4 right now, given how diverse all of the interaction is in the meta. Looking into the lands, nothing stands out except for that 2 snow-covered swamp. What is that all about? Well, I'm happy you asked. Snow-covered swamp. Now, when you sleeve this deck up, or when you log into Magic Online and you play your leagues, do you bother running a snow-covered swamp? Probably not, because there's almost no functional reason at all to run one, except for Ice Fang Coatl. The GOAT has played Reanimator so much, so consistently, and at such a high degree that he runs Snow-Covered Swamp so that his little flying snake can have Death Touch. Alright? Take a second to think about that. His little flying snake, Death Touch. That's how much this man has played Reanimator. I personally just find that insane. Not once in my entire Reanimator career, outside of the Oko days, have I ever once thought about sleeving a Snow-Covered Swamp to maybe have a corner case on the off chance that I reanimated Icefang Quaddle and somehow use that as a way to help myself to win a game. Not once has that ever come up, but the GOAT has grinded so much that it has come up enough times for him to want to only do that. That to me is insane, because that is the difference between someone who is great with the deck and someone who is just playing the deck. Oh, and by the way, in order for this to win, you need to have 2 Icefang Quaddles and 2 Snow-Covered Swamps. That's the only way it works in your favor. That is just insane. So, rounding out the lands, everything's an even 2 split on the fetchables. You got 1 Underground Sea, 1 Scrub Land, 2 Badlands. That's the exact perfect way to play it. Oh, and by the way, 2 Snow-Covered Swamp. Moving on to the sideboard, I'm going to run through all the cards one by one. Now, a little caveat. I'm not going to go over how to sideboard with Reanimator in this video. I'd ask that you check back from time to time, because in the future I hope to make a sideboarding guide and a video on how to sideboard with Reanimator. Reanimator wins or loses in the sideboard games. Your first game, it's always free. It's the free space on the bingo card. You'll win it just by sitting down at the table. Games 2 and 3, however, much more difficult to win. This is where the winners and losers are made. And the GOATS list is absolutely tuned to perfection, and I'll tell you why. Starting off with Coffin Purge, this card is only in the deck for the mirror match. I will say that it does have a small pocket case in some matches. If you know your opponent is going all in on Echo of Eons or a Past in Flames, those are times where you could consider bringing in Coffin Purge. But that's only if you have the read on your opponent going all in on that strategy. And it does happen, so I would keep an eye out for that. Just be wary that if they do that and they're on the play, you having Coffin Purge in your deck doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. Keep those things in mind as you're sideboarding. Silence is in the deck because there are several decks as fast as Reanimator and slightly more interactive. Decks like Doomsday, decks like Storm. That type of deck, fast combo decks, is the reason Silence is in the sideboard. Where a lot of intermittent and newer Reanimator players get caught up, is Silence can be good against blue decks. Blue-Red Delver and Blue-White Control. However, I really strongly suggest you don't really consider Silence in those matchups. So when you think about Silence, just think it's in there mostly for the combo decks. If you cast a Silence against a Doomsday in their upkeep, or say after they cast a Doomsday, or any time like that, it can really buy you those necessary turns for you to win. And it's important to play those outs. Echoing Truth is a card that I struggled with for a while. I couldn't figure out why it was in the GOAT sideboard. I would like to challenge you, the viewer, to find its primary purpose. And I'll tell you now, if you get it right, I'm going to give you a shout out in my next sideboarding video. But in the meantime, I'll tell you what Echoing Truth has always been used for. Echoing Truth mostly is in the deck for sticky creatures that can really hinder our game plan. Creatures like Emissary or Elvish Reclaimer. Those types of creatures where they can recur interaction against us in a very negative fashion. Serenity has always been in the deck for one purpose and one purpose only. Your opponent starts the game out with a Leyline of the Void and then casts a Chalice of the Void on one. Now, many decks aren't doing that these days. Most of the time, decks are either playing Leyline of the Void or Chalice of the Void, but not both. So Serenity's purpose is kind of modulated. Now its purpose is just to absorb as many cards as it can when you need it to, right? So either it eats up a Force of Will, or you completely wipe the board against Affinity. But those are really the only kind of cases that Serenity should be used for. Cases where either you're going to be exchanging a lot of cards on their board state or Serenity, several lands, maybe a Tormod's Crypt or a Soul Guide Lantern or a Kappa Cannoneer, or you're playing against someone who's running a deck list that has Leyline of the Void and Chalice of the Void, and they start the game out with that. Then you cast your Serenity, you blow them up, and you move on and you win the game. Fairy Macabre usually isn't ran in the Reanimator sideboard. However, the GOAT has decided to put it in here because Reanimator is very popular on MTGO. So if you're playing in your local meta, and you know that there aren't going to be very many Reanimator players, I would suggest sideboarding this out, maybe putting in another Serenity, Wear Tear, what have you, whatever works for you. But Fairy Macabre is only in there for the Reanimator sideboard. That's it. Show and Tell, everybody who's played Reanimator these days knows what Show and Tell is for. You sideboard out either Exhume if your opponent is playing big creatures that go into the graveyard too. You side out Animate Dead if they're playing Prismatic Ending or Abrupt Decay or what have you. You bring in the Show and Tells and you slam them. They're running the Teferi Time Reveler, Forces, and Endurance, and you fight through all the forces and they still have an Endurance. That's the kind of situation where you want to cast a Show and Tell. Those situations where they have answers in their hand to counter your spells, answers in their hand to tuck your graveyard, answers on the board to exile your graveyard, answers on the board that can have some sort of recursion that interacts with your graveyard, like Elvish Reclaimer into Pachuca Bog, scenarios like that. Show and Tell is your catch-all against all of your opponents. Wear and Tear's primary purpose these days is mostly for Urza Saga, believe it or not. The Tear portion of Wear Tear is just a 1-mana Stone Rain, and Urza Saga is really good and really difficult for us to interact with. Wear Tear is definitely one of the slower cards in this sideboard, but it's really just the best in slot. It does have a tertiary purpose too, of being 3 CMC, so if your opponent is really on the ball and they go for a Chalice on 1 and a Chalice on 2, it's literally the only spell that can get you out of that scenario and back into the game. But other than that, Wear Tear is mostly in the sideboard for these Urza Saga, or if they're going heavy on like a Soul Guide Lantern and they're just going to play it on turn 1, those types of games. And finally, the Reanimator Bay, Chancellor of the Annex. Chancellor has always been in the main board for Reanimator, but now she's moved to the sideboard. Chancellor of the Annex is mostly in this deck for the Storm matchup. It doesn't really get too much outside of that Storm matchup. So what Chancellor of the Annex does for you is just slow them down enough for you to tear apart their hand in order to win the game. So Chancellor of the Annex used to be sideboarded out pretty frequently, but now in those Storm matchups, we're going to want to sideboard her in. Chancellor of the Annex can often just win the game against ad nauseam tendril decks. So where we were once always sideboarding Chancellor out, now we get to sideboard Chancellor in. And in that sort of way, Chancellor's still got our backs. She's still there for us, and she's still helping us win games. And that for me is why Chancellor of the Annex is always the Bay. So to kind of wrap up the deck, where Reanimator once was get into a Chancellor bubble and then combo off, now it's interact with your opponent and combo off. But those two game plans, while they sound similar, they play out differently. And that's where it can be kind of hard to just pick this deck list up and think that you're going to slam an event. It takes a long time to figure out how to mulligan with this deck, but I promise you, if you take the time to really learn this list and to play it well, you'll find yourself mulliganing less and winning more. This deck is just streamlined to perfection. It is so good. It is so surgical. It is so clean. It's probably, if not just the best and most underrated deck in the format. Honestly, this deck is better than it has been in quite some time. This deck is the best it's been since Deathrite Shaman was banned and before Oko was printed, back when Reanimator was a true menace. It's still there, it's just nobody's playing it and it's really difficult. But this sideboard on this deck list makes it so easy. I want to kind of start winding down this video and just talk about other things that are going on in the Reanimator community. As I mentioned before, Archon and Canister are the only ones to put up any sort of result in the past 6 months. Mad props to them. This Archon list is spicy AF. I don't know how he just decided to sleeve it up and slam an event, but he did really good. To briefly go over this list, not too much is different in the main. In the sideboard, he plays the Lake package, 2 Lake of the Dead, 1 Grave Titan. He plays a lot of very slow cards like Shenanigans and Massacre. He plays 2 Profane Tutor, don't know for what. Maybe to find up the missing combo piece, maybe to interact with something that the opponent put on the board. Unfortunately, Archon did not make his run available on YouTube or anything, so I'm not quite able to see what he was thinking while he was playing this. That's what it seems like to me. My man Darkview, who has helped me tremendously, just be a better Reanimator player in general, has written a very, very good primer on the deck. He's gone over each and every individual card. He's talked about in great detail why you should or should not try some different things. His primer is absolutely essential to any beginner, intermediate player interested in the deck. And then other than that, we just got this really cool printing of Gristlebrand. He's got gold on him, so I run him. That's cool. And that kind of wraps up my State of the Reanimator. I'm finally freed from the reel, my stupid job that required me to work several 12-hour shifts per week, up to 7, as little as 4. I have a lot more time, and I hope to be putting out a lot more content. I'm also trying to think of how to make a how to sideboard with Reanimator video, but I'm not quite sure how to put that out yet because it's just so difficult and the deck list can change depending on where the meta's at. I'm also not active on too many social medias, pretty active on the Reanimator Discord, so mad shout outs to that. If you're interested in Reanimator and you want to learn more about the deck, I would suggest checking out the Reanimator Discord. I'll link that down below. Other than that, I hope this helps you a little bit. You know, Reanimator's playing a little bit differently, but it is amazing. Promise, if you try this list, you're going to get some wins. And I hope my video helped you get there. I've tried really hard. I haven't made too many videos, but I'm really enjoying my time doing so. So if you made it this far, I'm happy to have you. Leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think Echoing Truth is for. The answer may surprise you. And with that note, I'm out, gents. Peace.